The gate agent had already written the word. Uncooperative. In her notebook, when the cockpit door opened, the captain stepped out with his hat still on and the flight release in his left hand. He took 3 steps down the jet bridge, then he stopped cold. He was looking at a gray-haired woman standing near the aircraft door with her coat folded over one arm and an old leather briefcase held against her chest. A woman his own gate crew had just walked off his airplane, and Captain Andrew Boyd, 11,000 hours, 4 stripes on the shoulder, 41 years old, squared his shoulders and brought his heels together like a man half his age. "Ma'am," he said. Nobody moved. Not the agent, not the supervisor, not the security officer standing by the fire extinguisher with his hands loose at his sides, not the 12 passengers in first class who had turned around in their seats to watch, because none of them knew what he knew. And not one of them, not the agent with her pen still uncapped, not the man in the camel-colored sweater who had told her to just go sort it out downstairs, had any idea that in 2 hours and 43 minutes, that same woman would be sitting behind a microphone in room 2167 of the Rayburn House office building in Washington, D.C., with her right hand raised, about to tell the United States Congress exactly what had happened at Gate B-14 that morning. So, let's go back. Not to the gate. Further back than that. Because to understand what happened on that jet bridge, you have to understand a man who spent 31 years fixing airplanes he was never once allowed to fly. The house is a brick ranch on a quiet street in Decatur, Georgia, with a magnolia in the front yard that drops more leaves than any tree has a right to. Ruth Ann Calloway bought it with her husband Samuel in the fall of 2004, back when they still believed they were going to need the extra bedroom. There is a scuff on the doorframe of that bedroom, about waist high, where Samuel once carried a dresser through at a bad angle and said a word he immediately apologized for. Ruth has painted that hallway twice, and both times she has painted around the scuff. On the night before she flew to Washington, she did 4 things. The first was the ironing. She ironed a white blouse at the board in the den with the television off, the way her mother had taught her, sleeves last, and she thought about nothing in particular except the shirt. There is a certain kind of person for whom small, competent work is a form of prayer. Ruth Calloway is that kind of person. She has never in her life understood people who find peace by doing nothing. The second thing she did was call her sister. Ophelia Pryor Bishop is 63 years old and still lives in Mobile, Alabama, 4 blocks from the house they grew up in, and she answered on the second ring the way she has answered on the second ring since 1988. You ready? I'm ready. You don't sound ready. Ophelia, I'm just saying you get quiet when you're not ready, and you've been quiet since Sunday. Ruth sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the pale blue folder squared up on the placemat. They gave me 5 minutes, she said. 6 years of work, 11 carriers, 41 pages, and I get 5 minutes, and then a room full of people who have already decided what they think are going to ask me questions, designed to make me sound like I've got a grievance. Ophelia was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Daddy got 0 minutes." Ruth closed her eyes. I know it. 31 years and 0 minutes, and he never once got asked to come up to Washington and say a word about any of it. You've got 5. Use 'em. That's the second thing. The third thing Ruth Calloway did was take the folder into the den, sit down in Samuel's chair. She does not sit in it often. She is not sentimental in the way people expect, and she is much more sentimental in ways they never guess, and read her testimony out loud to an empty room for the 11th time. She had a stopwatch. She always has a stopwatch. She ran 4 minutes and 51 seconds, which left her 9 seconds of margin, which she considered thin but acceptable. And the fourth thing she did was open the briefcase and check that the wrench was in it. You cannot understand this woman without her father, so let me tell you about him now, and then we'll get to the airport. Elijah Pryor was born in Mobile, Alabama, in 1931, in a house with a tin roof and a pump in the yard. His own father worked the docks. His mother took in laundry and sang alto in a church choir for 40 years and could not read a word until she was 38, when she taught herself out of a Bible with a pencil. Elijah went to work at Brookley Field at 19 years old. He started sweeping a hangar floor. He finished, 31 years later, as the man they woke up at 2 in the morning when something was wrong that nobody else could find. He could tell you by sound alone whether a radial engine was running rich. He could put his flat palm on a cowling and give you the cylinder head temperature within 20 degrees. There is a story. Ruth has heard it from 3 different men, independently, which is about as close to verified as these things get. That in 1963, a colonel from another base flew in with an intermittent problem 4 different shops had failed to duplicate, and Elijah Pryor stood at the wingtip with his arms folded, listened to it run for 90 seconds and said, "Number 3 fuel lines chafing on a bracket." Somebody bent the bracket, and it was. Pilots asked for him by name. Wing commanders asked for him by name. Men wrote his name on their own paperwork so the aircraft would go to his bench. And in 31 years, Elijah Pryor was never once permitted to sit in the front seat of an airplane he had repaired. Not because he couldn't have, not because he lacked the eyes, the hands, the arithmetic, the nerve. He had all 4, in quantities that men with wings on their chests remarked on for 3 decades. Because in Mobile, Alabama, from 1950 to 1981, that was simply not a door that opened for a man like him. He fixed them. He handed them over. He stood back and watched them go up. Now, here is the thing about him that his daughter has never been able to explain to anybody's satisfaction, and has stopped trying. He was not bitter. He was not bitter. Not performatively unbitter, not swallowing it. Ruth watched that man for 26 years at close range, and she will tell you he genuinely was not eaten up. He came home, he ate supper, he laughed at the radio, he fixed the neighbors' cars for free, and got angry with them when they tried to pay him. What he did with it instead, and Ruth thinks about this more the older she gets, not less, was teach an 8-year-old girl to safety wire a fitting on the kitchen table while the dinner got cold and her mother stood in the doorway and let it happen. He gave her the 9/16 open-end wrench when she was 11 years old. He put it in her hand and he said, "That's yours now. Don't lend it to anybody who doesn't know what it's for." In the spring of 1976, Elijah Pryor drove his daughter 40 miles to an air show. She was 8. There was a heat shimmer coming up off the tarmac and a man selling snow cones out of the back of a truck and a demonstration team that came down the show line in tight formation, low enough to move the hair on your arms. Ruth Ann Pryor watched all 4 of those airplanes come over the top of a loop, and she turned around and looked up at her father, and she said, "Daddy, who does that?" And Elijah Pryor, who had by that point been fixing military aircraft for 26 years without ever being invited to fly one, looked down at his daughter and did not say. "Nobody like us." He said, "People who decided to. That's it. That's the whole inheritance." 3 words at an air show in 1976. She went to Tuskegee, which, if you know your history, is a sentence with a great deal of weight sitting on it, and it was not an accident. Her father drove her up there in a Ford with a bad alternator, and they had to stop twice. She commissioned in 1990. She went to pilot training at 22 years old, and she was the only black woman in her class, which was not unusual, and which she had been raised to expect and had decided in advance would be somebody else's problem rather than hers. Her first assignment was C-130s, cargo, big 4-engine turboprops that go into places nobody else wants to go into, carrying things nobody thinks about until they don't arrive. In 1991, her father drove up to Columbus, Mississippi to watch her fly. She took off in a T-37 with the sun coming up and her father standing on the ramp in 94-degree heat in his good shirt, and when she came back down, he did not say very much of anything at all. On the drive back to the motel, he pulled into the parking lot, put both hands on the top of the wheel, looked straight out through the windshield at nothing, and said, "Well, that was it. That was the whole speech. Ruth Calloway has been to 2 wars, 1 funeral for a husband, and a congressional hearing, and she will tell you that is still the finest thing anybody has ever said to her. Elijah Pryor died in 1994. His daughter was 26 years old and flying a C-130 out of a base in Europe when she got the call, and it took her 31 hours to get home. She kept the toolbox, she kept the wrench in her flight bag, and then in her briefcase, and she has carried it into every building she has ever been asked to prove herself in for the last 11 years. Airport security has never once stopped it. A 9/16 open-end wrench is 5.5 inches long. The rule says 7. She used to laugh about that with Samuel over breakfast. Daddy's wrench flies first class now. I want to give you one more piece before the airport, because it will matter when you hear how she handled that gate agent. In 1993, as a first lieutenant, Ruth Pryor, she had not yet married Samuel Calloway, that was 8 months off, sat down for a career counseling session with a squadron supervisor who was, by every measure available, a decent man. He had her folder open on the desk. He tapped it twice with 2 fingers and he said, "Kindly, have you thought about cross-flowing into support? Personnel, logistics, something like that? Honestly, Lieutenant, you'd have a real future over there." He meant it. That's the part people always get wrong when they tell this kind of story. He was not sneering. He believed he was doing her a favor. In his mind, he was steering a promising young officer away from a road that was going to be unnecessarily hard on her, and he probably went home that night and told his wife he'd tried to help a kid out. Ruth Pryor looked at him and said, "Sir, I have a real future here." He wrote her an adequate performance report. Not a bad one, an adequate one, which in that system is its own kind of sentence, because adequate is what you write when you want a file to stop moving without anybody being able to say you did anything. She got the next assignment anyway. She got it because a major named Ellis, whose name almost nobody remembers, made 2 phone calls he did not have to make. That's how it works. It has always worked that way. A file stops moving, and then somebody who does not have to picks up a telephone. Ruth Calloway spent the next 23 years being the person who picks up the telephone. She married Samuel Calloway in 1994, 3 months after her father's funeral, in a small church in Mobile with 51 people in it. He taught high school auto shop. He had grease under his fingernails on their wedding day, and she has said, many times, that it was the single most reassuring thing she had ever seen. He followed her to 4 bases in 11 years. He gave up a department chair to do it. When people asked him about that, he would shrug and say, "One of us was flying airplanes and it wasn't me." He died in November of 2021, in the recliner in the den, in the middle of a college football game he had already watched once. Ruth still walks down the hall in her stocking feet at 5 in the morning so as not to wake him. Some habits are a kind of love. You don't put them down just because the reason is gone. She woke at 10 minutes past 5 without an alarm clock, the way she has for 36 years. She made coffee in the percolator her mother used. She stood at the kitchen window while it worked and watched the streetlight go out on the corner. She did not turn on the television because she has a rule about the news before 6 in the morning, and the rule is, don't. At 5:40, she put on the gray tweed jacket. It is 15 years old and cut for a woman with slightly broader shoulders because she had slightly broader shoulders when she bought it. She had considered buying a new one for this. In September, she stood in a store in Buckhead in front of a rack of navy blazers for 11 minutes, and then she walked out and drove home and hung the gray tweed back on the closet door. The gray tweed is what she wore to Samuel's funeral. It is what she wore to her own retirement ceremony. It is, in a sense, the only jacket she owns that has ever been asked to hold anything up. At 5:50, she picked up the briefcase, cordovan leather, worn through to bare hide at both bottom corners, brass catch that has to be pressed twice, and at 6 o'clock exactly, Ruth Ann Calloway backed a 9-year-old Buick down the driveway and drove to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. She believed she was on her way to the second most important day of her professional life. She was wrong about which one it was going to be. Now I have to take you somewhere else, because this story has two people in it who got up early that morning, and if I only tell you about one of them, I will have told you a lie by omission. Kayla Brennan's alarm went off at 3:50 a.m. in a one-bedroom apartment in Marietta, Georgia, that she shared with a roommate who worked nights and whom she saw, on average, twice a week. She is 26 years old. Her mother, Patty Brennan, worked the night shift at a hospital in Cobb County for 19 years and raised 3 children on it. And there is a photograph on Kayla's refrigerator of her mother in scrubs, asleep, sitting up at a kitchen table, that Kayla's brother took as a joke when he was 14 and that Kayla has never found funny. Kayla took the airline job 14 months ago for the flight benefits because she had never been anywhere. She had a list on her phone, 9 cities. In 14 months, she had used the benefits exactly twice, both times to Orlando, both times because a friend was getting married. She was good at the job. That's important. She was not a careless employee. She had perfect attendance, and she was 2 weeks into a stretch of covering a coworker's shifts for free because that coworker's father was in the hospital. And here is the part that explains the rest of it. In the back office of that station, on the wall between the schedule board and the break room door, there is a whiteboard. On that whiteboard, updated weekly by hand, are the station's numbers, on-time departures, mishandled bags, and a column that had been added about 2 years earlier, near the bottom, under a heading somebody in a regional office had come up with. Cabin integrity, recovered seats. Every time a gate agent caught somebody who had moved themselves up into an empty premium seat after boarding, that agent got a mark. At the end of the month, the top 3 names got a gift card. Not a big one, $25, a chain restaurant, the kind of thing a company gives out when it wants a behavior for free. Kayla Brennan had been on that board once. Second place, April. She had taken a photograph of it and sent it to her mother. Now hold that in your hand for a second, because I am going to say something that this story depends on. Nobody at that airline ever told Kayla Brennan to look at black passengers. I want to be extremely clear about that. Nobody said it in a classroom. Nobody put it in a manual. Nobody said it in a meeting, or a memo, or a training video. If you had accused her supervisor of teaching that, he would have gone red in the face and been sincerely, genuinely offended, and he would have been telling you the truth as he understood it. What the company did was simpler, and worse. It put a reward on the wall for catching people. It handed a 26-year-old a slide that said, "Be alert to unauthorized cabin migration." And then, in the space where the actual procedure should have been, the part that tells you exactly what to look at and exactly what to do, it printed 2 words. Use judgment. That's the whole load-bearing wall. 2 words. And then there was the part that was not on any slide, which was a 51-year-old station supervisor named Doug Renner walking a new hire down Concourse B in her second week, being friendly, being helpful, genuinely trying to bring the kid along, and saying, "You'll get a feel for it." After a while, you just kind of learn who belongs up front. He meant it as mentorship. Under oath, he would have said so, and he would have believed it. But look at what is actually inside that sentence. You learn who belongs up front. Learn from where? From what? From every image that young woman had absorbed since she was 4 years old about who sits in which part of an airplane. From every movie, every commercial, every magazine, every airport she had ever walked through in her life. The company left a hole in the middle of a procedure and told a 26-year-old to fill it with her instincts, and then acted astonished at what her instincts turned out to contain. That is not a person problem. That is a procedure problem. Hold on to that. It is the entire story, and in about 3 hours, a woman is going to say it out loud into a microphone in Washington, and a congressman is going to try very hard to make her take it back. Meridian Airlines Flight 1147, Atlanta to Washington Reagan National. Scheduled departure, 7:15 a.m. Gate B14. She had bought the ticket herself, Hold on to that too, because it comes back. The committee would have reimbursed a coach fare. She paid the difference into first class out of her own checking account, $711, because she is 58 years old with a fused vertebra in her lower back, and because she has learned over a long career that the difference between arriving rested and arriving stiff is the difference between sounding certain and sounding tired, and she was not going to walk into that room sounding tired. She cleared security at 6:20. She bought a bottle of water. She did not buy a second cup of coffee. Then she sat in the boarding area with the briefcase on her lap and watched the ramp. That's the thing about people who have spent their whole lives around airplanes. They never stop watching the ramp. It isn't nostalgia. It's closer to a reflex, like a doctor who cannot sit at a dinner table without noticing somebody's color. She watched a fuel truck disconnect and coil its bonding cable properly, which pleased her. She watched a belt loader operator swing bags with his back instead of his knees, and she thought, that boy is going to be 45 with a spine like a question mark, and nobody's ever going to tell him because nobody ever tells anybody anything. She watched the first officer do the walk-around in the dark with a flashlight, and she noted with genuine approval that he actually put his fingertips on the static ports instead of just sweeping the light across them, which is the difference between a man doing an inspection and a man performing one. At 6:42, they called the flight. Ruth stood third in the priority line. Ahead of her was a woman in her 30s in expensive athletic wear with a canvas tote. Ahead of her was a man in a camel-colored cashmere sweater with a rolling bag that was visibly 2 inches too tall for the sizer standing 4 feet away, and nobody said one word about it. The agent at the podium scanned Ruth's boarding pass. The scanner chirped green. "Have a nice flight," the agent said, without looking up. Ruth walked down the jet bridge. Halfway along, on the left side, there is a small square window. And out of 40 years of habit, her eyes went to it. To the leading edge of the wing, the gaps between the slats, the thin dark seep around the main gear that is normal, and the kind that is not. 2 seconds, maybe less. Her body did it without asking her permission. She stepped aboard, turned left, and found row 2. Seat 2A. Window. Left side. She always takes the left side when she can. There is no practical reason for it anymore. There used to be a reason. The left seat is the captain's seat, and when she was 24 years old and one of a very small number of people in a wing of 600 who looked anything like her, she made a private decision that she would sit on the left side of every airplane she ever rode in, paying passenger, jump seat, anything, as a small promise to herself that nobody else on this earth ever had to know about. She has kept it for 34 years. She stowed the briefcase under the seat in front of her. She folded the tweed jacket across her lap. She put the water bottle in the seat pocket. Then she leaned her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes. 2 hours and 10 minutes of flight time. She intended to spend every one of those minutes not thinking about the folder. She got about 90 seconds. "Ma'am?" Ruth opened her eyes. A young woman was standing in the aisle, hair pulled back tight, a handheld scanner in one hand and a small spiral notebook in the other. Badge. Guy Brennan. And underneath, in smaller letters, Customer Service. She was smiling. And I want to be fair here, because the smile matters. It was not a cruel smile. It was the smile they teach you in a 4-day class in a beige building out past the cargo ramp, the one where they show you a slide about eye contact. "I think you might be in the wrong cabin," Kayla said. "Main cabin starts back there, just past the second galley." Ruth sat up straight. "I'm in 2A. "Right. It's just, sometimes the app puts people in the wrong spot." The smile stayed exactly where it was. Only the eyes changed. "Could I see your boarding pass real quick?" Ruth handed it over. Kayla scanned it. The scanner chirped green. Kayla looked at that screen for 4 full seconds. "The system does that sometimes," she said. "Do you have a photo ID on you?" "Now stop. Stop right there, because this is the exact point where people argue about this story afterward, and it is the exact point that Ruth Calloway would later explain to a subcommittee of the United States Congress more clearly than anybody in that room had ever heard it explained. Nothing had happened yet that any one person could point to. The agent had not raised her voice. She had not used one single word you could not say in a church basement. She had said, "Ma'am," twice, and she had meant it both times. If you had been sitting in 3C with your headphones in, you would have glanced up and seen a polite young employee helping a passenger with a seating question, and you would have gone back to your program, and you would have sworn under oath that nothing whatsoever was wrong. That is the entire mechanism. That is how it survives. Not in shouting, in courtesy. Across the aisle in 2C, the man in the camel sweater was reading box scores. Nobody asked him for identification. In 1A, a woman in her 40s was ordering a mimosa at 6:51 in the morning. Nobody asked her for identification. In 1D, a man in a golf pullover was already asleep with his mouth open. Nobody asked him for anything at all. Ruth Calloway reached into her purse, took out her Georgia driver's license, and handed it over. Kayla held it up, tilted it toward the reading light, turned it over, and studied the back. Then she asked the fourth question. "Where did you purchase this ticket?" And that is where the morning turned. Because you can be mistaken about a cabin, you can misread a scanner, you can have a bad screen, a bad system, a bad day. There is no version of a seating question on this earth that ends with, "Where did you purchase this ticket?" Ruth looked up at the young woman for a long moment. "What is it you need me to prove?" she asked. Her voice was low and level and unhurried, and she put a small space between each of the words. It was not the voice of an angry person. Kayla Brennan had been trained to handle angry people. She had a whole module on angry people. This was something else, and she had never heard it before, and she did not know what it was. It was the voice of a woman who spent 26 years transmitting critical information over a radio with poor reception to people who were frightened. You do not shout on a radio. You slow down. You separate your words. You make it structurally impossible to be misunderstood. "I'm just following procedure, ma'am." "Then let me ask you a better one," Ruth said. "This morning, on this airplane, how many other people in this cabin have you asked for identification?" The smile went out like a bulb. "I'll get my supervisor," Kayla said. Doug Renner came aboard at 6:56. 51 years old. A big man going soft through the middle. Reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. A lanyard heavy with keys. 19 years at that station. He coached his daughter's softball team for 6 seasons. He covered other people's shifts at Christmas without being asked. 2 different co-workers would later say, without prompting, that he was the first person they called when their cars broke down. I tell you all that because the easy version of this story wants him to be a monster, and he was not a monster, and if you make him one, you will learn absolutely nothing. Kayla briefed him in the forward galley in a low voice. Ruth could hear about a third of it. The third she could hear included the words, "Not cooperating." Renner came down the aisle. "Morning, ma'am. I understand there's a little confusion about the seat." "There's no confusion," Ruth said. "I'm in 2A. That's my seat. I bought it. Your scanner has now confirmed it twice." "Sure, sure." He put out his hand for the boarding pass. She gave it to him. He did not scan it. He just looked at it, which tells you everything about what was actually happening. "And you said you bought this yourself." "I did." "Any chance it came through a third party?" "Sometimes we get these consolidator fares that don't clear properly and the system will." "Sir," Ruth's voice did not rise. If anything, it went quieter, which is a thing certain people do, and it is far more effective. "I have now been asked 4 questions that nobody else in this cabin has been asked once. I would like you to tell me which specific policy I have violated." And Doug Renner did the thing people do when they are standing in the middle of something they do not want to look at directly. He got official. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step off the aircraft so we can sort this out on the ground." There it was. Now, the purser had been standing at the forward galley for about 90 seconds and had not said anything yet, and I need to introduce her properly, because she matters more than she thinks she does. Marion Whitlock, 54. 31 years with the airline, which means she started in an era of different uniforms and different weight rules and a different everything. 2 grown sons, a brick house in Kennesaw with a basketball hoop over the garage that nobody has used in 9 years. 14 months from a full pension. Marion stepped forward. "Doug," she said, "her seat is her seat." I pulled the manifest. "Callaway R2 Alpha. Purchased 41 days ago on a card that reads United States House of Representatives." That last part landed on the floor of that cabin like a dropped tray. Renner blinked. "Okay, well, that's actually a flag then. Government purchase. We'd need to verify." "You would need nothing," Ruth said. "It's a reimbursement account. It is a credit card. It functions exactly like every other credit card in this cabin." And this is where it went sideways. It went sideways for the oldest reason there is. A man with 19 years of seniority had now been contradicted twice, in front of a subordinate, in a confined space with an audience, and somewhere in the back of his skull a switch flipped over from. Is this correct? 2. I have already started. I have watched grown men lose careers to that switch. So have you. Ma'am, I'm asking you one more time to step off the aircraft. And from 2C, without looking up from his phone, in the reasonable voice of a reasonable man, the passenger in the camel sweater said, "Ma'am, why don't you just go sort it out down there? You're holding up the whole plane." Ruth turned her head and looked at him. He did not look back. He tilted his phone slightly, the way people do when they want a screen to become a wall. 3 rows back, a phone came up, then a second one. And Ruth Ann Callaway stood up. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She folded the tweed jacket over her left forearm, bent and drew the Cordovan briefcase out from under the seat, straightened, and walked forward toward the aircraft door. Back straight, chin level, eyes on the doorframe. She did not look at one single passenger. And I will tell you exactly what silenced that cabin, because it was not outrage. Outrage is loud, and loud is comfortable. As long as somebody is yelling, you get to tell yourself you are watching a dispute between 2 parties, and disputes have 2 sides, and you are free to go back to your phone. What silenced that cabin was the composure. 12 people in first class watched a 58-year-old woman walk off an airplane she had paid for out of her own checking account, and there was no shouting anywhere to hide behind, and every one of them had a moment, a short one, maybe a second and a half, where they had to sit inside the plain question of what exactly they were looking at. The man in 2C turned his phone face down on his knee. The jet bridge at gate B14 is lit with that flat white light that makes everybody look like they have been awake for 2 days. There is a bend in it about 15 feet back from the aircraft door, and a small window, and a fire extinguisher on the wall with an inspection tag hanging off it. Ruth stopped just past the bend. A uniformed officer from airport operations had come up and was standing with his hands loose at his sides, which she noticed and appreciated, because it meant he had been doing the job long enough to know that nothing in front of him required hands. Kayla Brennan had her notebook open. She was writing in it. Careful block letters, the way you write when you know somebody might read it later. She had gotten as far as, "Pax 2A, FC, refused to comply, uncode." That is the exact moment the cockpit door opened. Captain Andrew Boyd came out with his hat on and the flight release in his left hand. He intended to ask why his door was still open 11 minutes before push, because he had a slot time, a headwind, and a first officer running numbers. He took 3 steps. He stopped. He looked at the woman standing there in a gray tweed jacket with a leather briefcase held against her chest. And for about a second and a half, the face of a 41-year-old airline captain came completely apart, and what was underneath it was the face of a 26-year-old lieutenant sitting on a bench in a hallway in Mississippi, holding a paper cup of water with both hands, because one hand by itself was not steady enough. The flight release came down to his side. His shoulders came back. His heels came together. It was not a decision. It was something that had been sitting in his spine for 15 years, waiting for precisely this. "Ma'am." Kayla looked up from the notebook. "Captain, this passenger was—" "Ma'am," he said again, louder, and he was not speaking to Kayla at all. "It is very good to see you." Ruth tilted her head half an inch. "Boyd," she said, "you grew a beard. My wife says it makes me look distinguished." "Your wife is being kind to you." A laugh came out of him, short and not entirely steady. He put his hand over his mouth for a second, which is not a thing airline captains generally do on jet bridges. Then he turned to his station supervisor. "Doug, who did you just take off my airplane?" "Andy, we've got a boarding pass discrepancy, and the passenger declined to—" "That is not what I asked you." Boyd's voice was pleasant. "That was the frightening part. I asked you, who? You just took off my airplane." Doug Renner looked down at the boarding pass still in his hand, as though the answer might be printed on it. In a way, it was. So Captain Boyd told him. "That is Lieutenant Colonel Ruth Ann Calloway, United States Air Force, retired, 26 years of service, instructor pilot, flight examiner, chief of training for the 14th Flying Training Wing at Columbus Air Force Base, Mississippi." He paused. "She signed my first solo, and 15 years ago, she is the only reason I am standing in this uniform instead of selling farm equipment in Cedar Falls, Iowa, because when an entire room of people decided that I was the problem, she was the only one who went and read the file. The jet bridge went so quiet you could hear the ventilation fan and, faintly, somebody's phone alarm going off inside the cabin." Kayla Brennan looked down at her notebook. At the word she had almost finished writing, and very slowly she closed it. To understand what Andrew Boyd meant by that, you have to go back 15 years, to a hot, flat piece of Mississippi in the middle of June. Columbus Air Force Base sits in Lowndes County, 10 miles north of the town of Columbus, and if you have never stood on that ramp in summer, I can tell you the air comes off the concrete at 115 degrees, and it smells like jet fuel and cut grass, and it does not move at all. Second Lieutenant Andrew Boyd was 26 years old. He came to pilot training late, by way of 4 years at Iowa State and 18 months selling combine harvesters for his uncle while he waited on a training slot that kept getting pushed. His grandfather, Walter Boyd, flew 31 missions in a B-17 out of England and came home to Iowa and never talked about a minute of it, except one evening on a porch in the summer of 1998 when Andrew was 13 and asked exactly the right question at exactly the right minute, and his grandfather set down a glass of tea and talked for 2 hours. Andrew Boyd wanted to fly from that porch forward. Nothing else ever seriously competed. He was not the most naturally gifted student in his class. He was, by every instructor evaluation on file, in the top third in climbing, and he had exactly one persistent weakness that showed up in his grade sheets over and over, in slightly different language. Tends to over-verify, slow to commit under compound task loading. Which, in plain English, means, when things got busy, Andrew Boyd wanted to be. Sure. That is a beautiful quality in a man who is going to take 200 people into Denver in a snowstorm at the age of 41. It is a difficult quality in a 26-year-old strapped into a T-38 Talon, a 50-year-old supersonic trainer with 2 small engines, a very short attention span, and a reputation, honestly earned, as the airplane that finds out who you are. On the 9th solo of the syllabus, at 4,000 feet over the local training area, Boyd got a fuel control malfunction on the right engine. Now, this was not a dramatic emergency, And I want to be very clear about that, because the drama in this story is not where you think it is. Nothing was on fire. Nothing exploded. The engine did not seize or come apart. What happened was that the right engine began responding to throttle inputs about a second and a half late and would not hold a stable setting. That is an entirely survivable, entirely manageable situation that gets handled by pilots somewhere in the world every single week. He did exactly what he had been taught. He got the airplane straight and level. He identified the affected engine. He confirmed it. He reached down and pulled out the emergency procedures checklist, which, in that aircraft, is a small booklet with a stiff cover, and every student in that wing had been told every single day for 11 months that the booklet is the final authority. You follow it. You do not improvise around it. Pilots who improvise around checklists are how you get memorial scholarships named after people. Step 1, he executed correctly. Step 2, he executed correctly. Step 3, he executed correctly. And then he read Step 4. And Step 4 told him to confirm a switch was in a position that Step 2 had just required him to move it out of. Read that again, slowly, because it is the whole story. Step 4 assumed a configuration that Step 2 had made impossible. Now put yourself in that cockpit. You are 26 years old. You are alone. You are the kind of young man whose entire personality is... Make sure. You have an airplane that is not behaving, and one working engine you are not certain about, and a document in your lap that the United States Air Force has told you is the last word on Earth. And that document has just instructed you to do something that cannot be done. Andrew Boyd froze for 7 seconds. 7 seconds does not sound like much. Say it out loud sometime. 1001, 1002, all the way to 7, with an airplane doing 320 knots and a checklist in your lap that has stopped making sense. He came out of it. He got the affected engine to idle, declared an emergency, and flew a single-engine pattern back to the field. He landed it. He landed it a little fast and a little flat, and on the rollout the nose gear collapsed, and the airplane went off the left side of the runway into the grass and stopped there in a slow red cloud of Mississippi dust. Nobody was hurt. Andrew Boyd walked away from it under his own power. The aircraft was repaired. The estimate came in somewhere north of $400,000. 11 days later, the Flying Evaluation Board convened. If you have never been near one of these, here is what it is. A formal proceeding with a panel of senior officers who decide whether a pilot keeps his wings. It is not a court. There is no jury. It is a long table, a pitcher of water nobody drinks from, and men who have been flying since you were in grade school. The recommendation that came out of that room was elimination. The finding, in the language of the memorandum, was demonstrated inability to manage compound emergency task loading, delayed decision-making inconsistent with the demands of the aircraft. When you are 26 years old, that sentence does not mean you failed a class. It means it is over. Not the syllabus, the whole thing, the porch, the grandfather, the 2 hours of a man finally talking. Andrew Boyd sat down on a bench in the hallway outside that room with a paper cup of water held in both hands, because one hand alone was not steady enough. He called his mother in Cedar Falls and told her he was probably coming home. Then he sat there for another 40 minutes, because he could not make himself stand up. And that is where Lieutenant Colonel Ruth Calloway found him. She was 43 years old. She had been chief of training in that wing for 14 months. She stopped in that hallway and looked down at him. He started to get up. She said, "Sit down, Lieutenant." And then she asked him one question. 1. When you froze, what were you looking at? Most people would have asked. What were you thinking? That is the human question. It is also the useless one, because a frightened 26-year-old does not know what he was thinking, and if you make him guess, he will invent something and then believe it for the rest of his life. Boyd said, "Step 4, ma'am." She said, "For 7 seconds?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." Ruth Calloway stood there a moment with her arms folded. Then she said, "Go get some sleep, Lieutenant," and she walked away down the hall, and Andrew Boyd went back to his room and did not sleep at all. She listened to the cockpit voice recording 19 times. At night, in her office. Door open, hallway lights off, legal pad, a stopwatch, and a pot of coffee that got worse every hour. She did it because of one thing she heard on the 11th pass. About 4 seconds into the silence, under the engine noise, under the airflow, you can hear paper. A single, distinct sound of a page being turned. Back. He had not frozen. He had gone. Backward. In the checklist to reread Step 2, because he assumed he had made a mistake. He had not made a mistake. The document had. So she pulled the document. And what she found is the most ordinary story in the world. 14 months earlier, the Wing's Standardization and Evaluation Office had consolidated 2 older emergency procedures into one combined checklist. It was a reasonable idea. It reduced page count. It reduced the odds of a student flipping to the wrong page under pressure. On paper, it was an improvement. And in the merge, some tired captain at 11 o'clock at night, with 4 other tasks on his desk and a family at home, had dropped a single line in the transition between the 2 old procedures. One line, gone, which left Step 4 sitting there referring to a switch position that Step 2 had already changed. Then Ruth Calloway did the thing the board had not done. She went and looked at whether it had happened before. She pulled 18 months of hazard reports, not accident reports. Hazard reports. The low-grade paperwork a pilot files when something was strange but nothing broke. The stuff that goes into a database and sits there in the dark. She found 3 separate student pilots, 3 different squadrons, 14 months. All 3 had written some version of the same sentence. Momentary confusion at Step 4. Not one of them had bent an airplane, so not one person had ever gone looking. The reconvened board met on a Thursday morning. Lieutenant Colonel Calloway came in with a bound folder and asked the president of the board for 8 minutes. She put the checklist up on the projector with Step 4 circled in red. She read Step 2 aloud. Then she read Step 4 aloud. And then she stopped talking and let the room sit inside it for a full 5 seconds, which was the single most effective thing she did all morning, because there is no argument on earth as powerful as a group of experienced men reading a contradiction with their own eyes. Then she put up the 3 hazard reports. And then she said the sentence that Andrew Boyd would carry with him for the rest of his natural life. Gentlemen, the officer is not broken. The checklist is broken, and if we eliminate him for reading it correctly, we will do this again. And the next time, we will do it to somebody who does not walk away. There were 2 colonels in that room from the standardization office. It was their document. One of them, a full colonel named Wade Harmon, a competent officer and, on most days, a decent enough man, asked her a question in a tone that could be defended afterward as strictly procedural. He asked whether she had considered the implications of raising this at a board rather than through the appropriate staff channels. And then he added 5 words. Given your position, Colonel. Given your position. She understood precisely what she had just been asked. She had been understanding that question, in one wording or another, every day for 21 years. She said, "Yes, sir, I have." And she signed the dissent. The checklist was corrected the following month. The correction went out through Air Education and Training Command to every base flying that aircraft in the United States. Andrew Boyd was reinstated. Ruth Calloway put him back in the airplane 3 days later, herself, in the back seat. She said nothing to him the entire flight. Not one word of encouragement, not one word of reassurance. She ran him around the pattern until his flight suit was soaked through and his hands had stopped being polite about it. Then she took him out to the training area and gave him the same malfunction. Twice. The second time, she failed something else on top of it, which was not in the syllabus that day and was arguably not authorized. He handled it. When they were back on the ramp with the canopy up and the heat pouring into the cockpit like water into a boat, she pulled off her helmet and looked at him in the mirror. She said, "You don't owe me anything, Lieutenant. You owe the next one." And then she climbed out and walked in, and she never mentioned it to him again. Here is the part Andrew Boyd did not learn until 2019, and he did not learn it from her. He learned it from a retired Chief Master Sergeant named Ray Dubose at a reunion in San Antonio, who had a beer in his hand and absolutely no reason to lie. Lieutenant Colonel Ruth Ann Calloway was passed over for promotion to full colonel that year, and again the following year. She retired in 2016 at 26 years of service, at the rank she had held since 2008. Nobody ever said the two things were connected. Nobody ever writes that down. That is not how any of this works. Not in the military, not at an airline, not at a bank, not in a school district, not anywhere. Careers do not get ended. They get slowed. A name stops moving. A phone stops ringing quite as often. A person gets described in writing as solid instead of outstanding, which sounds like a compliment and functions like a door closing. And every individual decision along the way has a perfectly reasonable individual explanation. Every one. You can hold any single one of them up to the light and find nothing. It is only when you line them all up in a row that they make a shape. Andrew Boyd asked her about it exactly once, at a retirement dinner in 2019, badly, over dessert, because he had been carrying it for 4 months and could not carry it any further. Ruth Calloway looked at him over the rim of a coffee cup and said, "I got what I traded for, Andy. Don't you dare feel bad about being the thing I bought." For 15 years, there has been a laminated card folded into the front pocket of Captain Andrew Boyd's flight bag. It is a copy of the corrected checklist, the revised one, with the restored line. He has carried it through 2 airlines, 4 aircraft types, 1 bankruptcy, a merger, and 11,000 hours of flying. New first officers ask about it. They always do, eventually, usually somewhere over Tennessee at 2 in the morning. And he always tells them the same thing. "Somebody fixed that for me once." Back on the jet bridge at Gate B14, Kayla Brennan had gone the color of paper. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. I didn't know you were—" Ruth raised one hand, gently. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said. "That is the entire point." She let that sit for a second. "If I were a retired nurse, if I were a school bus driver, if I were unemployed and flying to my sister's funeral on a ticket the church took up a collection for, my boarding pass would be exactly as valid as it is standing here right now." She looked at the young woman steadily. "You are not in trouble with me because you stopped the wrong woman. You are in trouble with me because you stopped." Captain Boyd already had his phone out. "I'm reporting this to the duty manager, and I want written statements from—" "Boyd." He stopped. "Don't get her fired. Ma'am, think it all the way through." Ruth shifted the briefcase to her other arm. "You fire her, and the company issues a very nicely written statement about how this does not reflect who we are, and the position is backfilled in 3 weeks. And on the first Monday of next month, at this same gate, at this same hour, the exact same thing happens to somebody who does not happen to have a captain on board who knows her name." She turned back to Kayla. "How old are you?" 26. "How long have you been here?" 14 months. "Who trained you?" Kayla opened her mouth, closed it, and her eyes went, without her permission and without her meaning them to, about 4 feet to her left. "To Doug Renner." "That's right," Ruth said quietly. "You did not invent this. You were taught it, and whoever taught you was taught it by somebody else. This does not have a beginning that anybody in this jet bridge is old enough to remember." Then she turned to Renner. "What I want this morning is not her, Mr. Renner. What I want is the checklist. Renner frowned. The what? Your training material. The module. The slide deck, the job aid, whatever it is you people call it in that building. Her voice never rose one note. The document that told a 26-year-old to identify passengers who don't belong in a premium cabin, and then left it entirely to her to work out what that means. I would like a printed copy. This morning, before this aircraft departs. Ma'am, I can't just hand out internal. Mr. Renner, she said his name the way you set a heavy object down on a table. You have already removed a paying passenger from an aircraft this morning. You are going to be asked about that. By somebody, at some point, in some room, and you already know it, because you have been standing there for 4 minutes trying not to know it. I am offering you the chance to be a man who cooperated. Doug Renner stood there. 4 seconds. 5. Then he took the reading glasses off his forehead, rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, turned around, and walked back up the jet bridge toward the printer behind the podium. And Ruth Calloway set the briefcase on top of the fire extinguisher cabinet, pressed the brass catch twice, and drew out the pale blue folder. She held it up so they could all read the cover. She held it up. Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. This. U.S. House of Representatives. Subcommittee on Aviation. Hearing on discriminatory treatment of passengers and employees. In commercial aviation. Vibe. Expert witness. Lieutenant Colonel Ruth A. Calloway. USAF. RE-T. Tuesday, 10 a.m., Rayburn House Office Building, room 2167. Captain Boyd read it twice. He looked up. You're flying to Washington, today, to testify. About. This. About this, Ruth said. Kayla Brennan put her hand over her mouth. And Ruth Calloway. And this is the detail that every person who was standing there mentions first, every time, without fail, reached out and put her hand on that young woman's shoulder. Breathe, she said. You have a long day ahead of you. So do I. Let's both get on the airplane. Meridian 1147 pushed back from gate B14 at 7:37 in the morning, 22 minutes behind schedule. Ruth Calloway was in 2A. They tried to bring her a glass of champagne. She said no thank you and asked for water and a pen. Somewhere over South Carolina, she put the tray table down, opened the pale blue folder to the last page of her prepared testimony, and began writing in the margin in small, square, engineer's handwriting. She wrote the time, 6:52 a.m. She wrote the gate, B14. She wrote the flight number. Then she wrote out all 4 questions, in order, exactly as they had been put to her, and beside them she drew a second column. In that column she wrote the number of times each of those 4 questions had been put to the other 4 passengers seated within 8 feet of her. 0, 0, 0, 0. She did not write Kayla Brennan's name anywhere on that page. What she wrote instead was, Gate Agent, age 26, 14 months of service, executing precisely what she was trained to execute. Then she folded Doug Renner's printout, 9 pages, still warm from the podium printer, slide 14 on page 6, and clipped it to the inside back cover of the folder. Marion Whitlock came down the aisle after the first service and stopped at row 2. She put her hand on the seat back and looked at a point somewhere above Ruth's head, the way people do when the thing they are about to say is heavy. 31 years, she said quietly. I have stood in that galley more times than I want to tell you and watched something like this start. And I knew exactly what it was. And I said nothing. Because I have 2 sons and a mortgage and 14 months to my pension, and it is very, very easy to decide that it is not your business. Ruth looked up at her. This morning you said my seat was my seat. It was already too late by then. Late is better than never, Ruth said. Next time, earlier. Marion nodded once. Her mouth went tight. She went and busied herself with the coffee, and she did not come back down that aisle for a while. 20 minutes out of Washington, a young man came forward from the main cabin. 17 years old, tall, in a good shirt that his mother had clearly pressed for him at 5 o'clock that morning, holding a phone in both hands. His name was Jalen Ford, and he was flying to Washington that day to tour Howard University with his Aunt Yvette, who was sitting in 24C watching him walk up that aisle with her heart in her throat. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. I recorded it, the whole thing at the gate. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Ruth turned in her seat. "Have you posted it?" "No, ma'am. Not yet. But I could. I've got a friend who—" He stopped. Something crossed his face, and he said, more honestly, "I was going to. I was pretty mad, ma'am. Would you do me a favor instead?" "Yes, ma'am." "Don't post it." Jalen blinked at her. "Ma'am, people should see that. People will see it," Ruth said. "But if you put it up this afternoon, do you know what it turns into? It turns into entertainment. 2 million people will watch 9 seconds of it. Half of them will decide it was about a rude young woman having a bad day, and the other half will spend 3 days arguing with strangers about it. And by Thursday, there will be a different video. And nothing on this earth will have changed." She reached into the seat pocket, took out a card, and wrote a name and an email address on the back of it in that same square handwriting. "That is the counsel for the subcommittee. Denise Okoro. Send it to her. Unedited, full length, with the date and the time and your name on it. Let it be evidence instead of entertainment." Jalen Ford looked at that card for a long moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And then, because he was 17 and because you only get certain chances once, he asked, "Ma'am, were you scared?" Ruth Calloway thought about it honestly, the way she thinks about most questions. "No," she said. "I was tired. That's worse." Scared wears off. Meridian 1147 touched down at Reagan National at 9:17 a.m. They came off the runway and turned onto the taxiway with the river out the left side and the low gray shapes of the city standing up beyond it. And as the airplane rolled toward the ramp, the chime sounded in the cabin. And Captain Andrew Boyd came on the public address system. It was not the arrival announcement. Everybody in that cabin knew it inside of 4 words, because he was speaking slowly, and airline captains do not speak slowly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Boyd. Before you get off this airplane, I need to say something, and I would rather you heard it from me than from anybody else. This morning, at Gate B14 in Atlanta, a passenger holding a valid, fully paid first-class ticket was removed from this aircraft. There was no security concern, there was no policy violation. She was asked 4 questions that no other passenger in that cabin was asked, and when she declined to be treated that way, she was walked off my airplane. That happened on my aircraft, under my command. I was in the cockpit and I did not know about it, and that is not an excuse, because everything that happens on this airplane belongs to me. That is what the 4th stripe means. It does not mean I get to say I wasn't told. So I want to apologize to her personally, not on behalf of the company. Companies don't apologize. Companies issue statements. This is me. And there is one more thing, and then I will let you all get on with your day. 15 years ago, I was a 26-year-old pilot sitting in a hallway outside a room full of people who had all decided that the problem was me. Every one of them outranked me. Every one of them was certain, and every single one of them was wrong. One officer in that entire building took the time to go and read the file. She is sitting in seat 2A. Welcome to Washington. Thank you for flying with us. Nobody applauded. It was not the kind of silence that turns into applause. It was the other kind, the heavier kind. The kind where 140 grown adults sit still for 4 or 5 seconds and do a genuinely unusual amount of thinking. The man in 2C was the last person in first class to stand up. He stood in the aisle a long time with the camel sweater folded over his arm, watching a gray tweed jacket move up the jet bridge and out of sight. He did not say anything at all. Reagan National to Capitol Hill is 15 minutes without traffic, and 35 with it. Ruth Calloway got a cab at 9:26. The driver was a man from Addis Ababa named Tesfaye, who had been driving that route for 9 years, and when she said, "Rayburn Building, and I have an appointment at 10, he looked at her once in the mirror, said, "Yes, ma'am," and got her there at 9:44. She went through security. The wrench went through the X-ray in the Cordovan briefcase, and the officer looked at the screen and looked at her and waved her on. 5.5 inches. The rule says 7. She stopped in a restroom on the second floor and looked at herself in the mirror for approximately 4 seconds, which is all the time she has ever been willing to give that particular activity, and straightened the gray tweed jacket and went upstairs. Room 267 of the Rayburn House office building has a high ceiling and green carpet, and it smells like old paper and the warm dust that comes off big lights. The members sit up on a raised dais in a long, shallow curve. The witness table is a slab of dark wood with 3 microphones on it and a pitcher of water that nobody in the history of that room has ever actually poured. Ruth Calloway sat down at 9:51. She adjusted the microphone stem. She set the pale blue folder square in front of her, lined up with the edge of the table, because that is how she sets things down. At the back of the room, standing against the wall by the door, was a man in an airline captain's uniform holding his hat in both hands. He had given away his Washington-Atlanta return leg to a reserve captain in order to be in that room. It cost him a full day of pay and an argument with crew scheduling, and he would tell you it was the cheapest thing he ever bought. The chairman gavelled in at 10 o'clock. The oath was administered. Ruth Calloway raised her right hand and said, "I do." "Colonel Calloway, you're recognized for 5 minutes." And Ruth Calloway did not open the folder to page 1. "Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, I have submitted written testimony of 41 pages, built on 6 years of data from 11 carriers. It's in the record, and I am not going to read it to you. With the committee's permission, I would like to begin with something that happened 3 hours and 5 minutes ago. The red lights came on above the cameras at the back of the room. At 6:52 this morning, at gate B14 at Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta, I was removed from an aircraft on which I held a valid, paid, first-class ticket that I purchased myself. You could hear that room change. There is a particular stillness that comes over a hearing room when 40 people realize at the same moment that they are not going to be looking at their phones for a while. She went through it flatly. No adjectives anywhere. Time, gate, flight number. The 4 questions, in the order they were asked. The second column. 0, 0, 0, 0. Now, I want to be careful here, she said, because the easy version of this story is wrong, and the easy version is what kills the reform every single time. The easy version is that a young woman at that gate is a bad person. I do not believe that. I met her. I spoke with her. She is 26 years old. She has been with that carrier 14 months, and I do not believe there was one moment this morning when she thought she was doing anything other than her job. And that is exactly what should concern this committee. She opened the folder to the back and unclipped 9 warm pages. I have here that carrier's own training material for gate agents, provided to me this morning at my request by a station supervisor in Atlanta. I'd ask that it be entered into the record. Page 6. Item 14. It instructs agents to monitor unauthorized movement into premium cabins. It tells them to be alert, and then, in the space where the actual procedure ought to be, the part that tells you what to look at, what to say, and what to do, the document contains 2 words. Use judgment. 2 words. And in the hole where a procedure should be, this company has asked a 26-year-old to pour in her own instincts. I would also ask the committee to look at page 9, which describes a monthly recognition program for what they call recovered seats. There is a scoreboard on a wall in that station. There is a gift card at the end of the month. We have put a bounty on suspicion, given no definition of what suspicion should be based on, and then expressed surprise at who gets suspected. She squared the pages. Members of the subcommittee, I spent 26 years in military aviation. I have written procedures, I have evaluated procedures, and I have taken procedures apart in a room after they hurt somebody. I am going to tell you the most important thing I learned in all of it. When you find a person who made a mistake, you have found the last link in the chain. You have not found the cause. And if you stop there, if you fire that person and go home, you will feel that you have addressed it, and you will do the same thing again next quarter, because you left the cause bolted to the wall. In 2011, I sat on a board that was about to end a young officer's career for failing to execute an emergency checklist correctly. That checklist contained a contradiction. Step 4 required a condition that Step 2 prohibited. He did not fail. He read it accurately, and it did not make sense, and it cost him 7 seconds and a nose gear and very nearly a life's work. 3 other students had reported confusion at that same step in the preceding 14 months. Nobody looked, because nobody had bent an airplane yet. We did not fire him. We fixed the document. In the 15 years since, not one pilot has hesitated at that step again, and the young officer we almost eliminated flew me here this morning. She closed the folder. So I am not here to ask you to punish a gate agent in Atlanta. I am here to ask this committee to require carriers to do what aviation safety has already known how to do for 60 years. Require that every screening interaction that results in a passenger being denied a seat be logged. The reason, the outcome, the demographics, not to assign blame, to find the Step 4. Because right now this industry has hazard reports that nobody reads until somebody bends an airplane. And I would submit to this committee that a 58-year-old woman being walked off an aircraft in front of 140 people on a ticket she paid for herself is a bent airplane. We have simply decided not to count it. She paused, and for the first time in 5 minutes her voice did something other than hold perfectly steady. One last thing, Mr. Chairman, and then I will take your questions. My father's name was Elijah Pryor. He worked on aircraft engines at Brookley Field in Mobile, Alabama, for 31 years. Pilots asked for him by name. Wing commanders asked for him by name. He could tell you what was wrong with an engine from 40 feet away, with his eyes closed. In 31 years, he was never once permitted to sit in the front seat of an airplane he had repaired. Not because of anything he lacked, because of a set of rules that nobody in Mobile in 1955 would have described as rules. They would have called it common sense. They would have said, you just kind of learn who belongs up front. She reached into the briefcase and took out a small steel wrench and set it on the table beside the microphone. It made a small, precise sound against the wood, and the room heard it, because the room was silent. He gave me this when I was 11 years old. He has been gone 32 years, and I would like very much to be able to tell him that we finally wrote the procedure down, that we stopped asking 26-year-olds to supply the missing line out of their own instincts, because until we do, we are going to keep finding out what is in those instincts. One gate at a time, and it is always going to be somebody's father or somebody's daughter standing there holding a ticket, being asked to prove something that the man beside her was never asked to prove at all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to take your questions. Here is the part people forget, because it is not the part that makes a good clip. She was not applauded. Congressional hearings do not work that way. What happened next was that a member from the other end of the dais leaned into his microphone. His name was Representative Hollis. He is a serious man, and he was not there to be cruel, and he asked her the hardest question of the morning. Colonel Calloway, I'll say at the outset that what happened to you this morning sounds indefensible, and I'm sorry it happened. But I want to press on something, because I represent a district with a lot of people who work at a lot of gates. You're asking us to mandate a federal logging requirement on every denied boarding in the United States. That is a real cost. That is hours, systems, training, compliance. And the carriers are going to tell this committee that the underlying problem here is a handful of bad employees, and that the answer is better hiring and faster termination, not a federal paperwork mandate on an industry that already has more paperwork than it can carry. Why are they wrong? And Ruth Calloway did something that a great many witnesses in that room over the years have not done. She thought about it for 4 full seconds before she answered. Congressman, that is the right question, and I want to answer it seriously. They are wrong for one reason, and it is a reason your district understands better than most. Bad employees are rare. Bad procedures are everywhere. If this were about a handful of bad people, then the same handful would have to be simultaneously employed at 11 different carriers in 31 different cities, which is what my written testimony documents. That is not a hiring problem. No hiring department on earth is that unlucky. And here is the practical part. You cannot fire your way to a fixed system. You can only fire your way to a quiet one. Every termination removes one person and teaches everybody who is left exactly one lesson, and it is not the lesson you want. The lesson they learn is, do not get caught on video. Not. Here is what the procedure actually is. You will have bought silence and called it progress. As for cost, sir, I would ask the committee to consider what this industry already logs. We log every bird strike, every one. A sparrow hits a wingtip in Tulsa, and there is a form. We log unstable approaches. We log the temperature of the food. We log the number of minutes a lavatory was out of service. We log every one of those things because somebody, decades ago, understood that you cannot fix what you refuse to count. So the question in front of you is not really about cost. This industry is extraordinary at counting things. The question is whether we are going to count this one. Because at the moment, sir, the only record that exists of what happened to me this morning is 4 minutes of video taken by a 17-year-old boy on his way to look at a college, and a note in a young woman's spiral notebook that stops in the middle of a word. Representative Hollis looked down at his papers for a second. Then he said, "Thank you, Colonel. I yield back." 800 miles away, in a break room in Concourse B, with a vending machine and a chair that has been broken since March, Kayla Brennan sat watching a hearing on her phone, with a cup of coffee going cold in both hands. She heard herself described exactly. Her age, her tenure, the 4 questions, the scoreboard on the wall behind her, the whole shape of it, laid out in front of the Congress of the United States by a woman who had every reason on earth to want her punished, and her name was never spoken. Not in the testimony, not in the written record, not in the 4 minutes and 11 seconds of video that Jalen Ford emailed to Denise Okoro at 9:44 that morning from the back of his aunt's rental car on the George Washington Parkway. Not once. And that is what finally undid her. Not being named. Not being named and recognizing herself anyway. She sat in that break room and cried for 11 minutes, and then she washed her face in the restroom down the hall, and then she went back out to gate B14 because she had a 2:15 departure and 140 people who needed to get to Cleveland. The rest of it took a while. Real things do. There was no lawsuit. Ruth Calloway never filed one, and she was asked why by 3 separate reporters, and she gave all 3 of them the same answer. A settlement is a payment for silence. I am not for sale, and I am not finished talking. Meridian Airlines did what companies do first. They issued a statement. It contained the word values. Twice and the word Procedure. Not at all. Then, 4 months later, they did something considerably better, because a congressional subcommittee had their training module in the official record and had begun asking about it in writing. And there is nothing on this earth that concentrates a corporation's attention like a letter with a due date on it. They rewrote it. The new gate procedure runs to 2 pages. There is no judgment call anywhere in it. It has 3 specific, named triggers in plain language, and it requires that if an agent cannot say out loud which of the 3 applies, the interaction ends right there. It requires that every denied boarding be logged with a reason code. The reason code list has no blank line on it. The scoreboard came down off the wall in the back office. So did the gift cards. Doug Renner was not fired. He was retrained. And then, 8 months after that, he did the thing nobody predicted. He requested a transfer into the training department. He is 52 years old now, and he teaches that 2-page procedure to new hires 4 times a month in a beige building out past the cargo ramp, and he opens every single class the same way. He says, "Before we start, I want to tell you about a morning at Gate B14, and I want to tell you about a sentence I used to say to new agents, a sentence I thought was helpful, and about exactly how wrong it was. Some men spend their whole lives never once saying that out loud." Kayla Brennan is still with the airline. She is a lead agent now, and she is being looked at for a supervisor slot. She still carries a small spiral notebook in her uniform pocket. The same one. There is a page in it with a word on it that was never finished. Unco. And she has never torn it out, and one time a new hire asked her about it, and she told him the whole story, standing right there on the jet bridge, and made them both late. Marion Whitlock retired the following November with a full pension. At her party, somebody asked her the standard question, the best thing she'd learned in 32 years of flying. Everybody expected something about weather, or passengers, or the old days. She said, "Say it earlier." Jalen Ford started at Howard that fall. He is 20 years old now. Last spring, he soloed a Cessna 172 out of a field in Maryland on a cold, clear morning, and he came down and got out of the airplane and stood on the ramp for a minute, and the first person he called was not his mother. She picked up on the second ring. He said, "Ma'am, I did it." And Ruth Calloway said, "Of course you did. Now go call your mother." Captain Andrew Boyd flew that same route, out of that same gate, for another 2 years. On the morning the new procedure took effect, he came up the jet bridge early, before his crew arrived, and photographed the laminated card mounted beside the podium at Gate B14, the new one, 2 pages, no judgment call anywhere in it. He emailed it to a brick ranch house in Decatur, Georgia. The subject line was 3 words. Somebody fixed it. Ruth Ann Calloway opened that email at 10 minutes past 5 in the morning at her kitchen table, with the percolator working behind her and the streetlight going out on the corner. She looked at it for a while. Then she got up and walked down the hall in her stocking feet, the way she has for 36 years, and took her father's 9/16 open-end wrench out of the Cordovan briefcase and set it on the shelf in the den beside Samuel's reading glasses. That is where it stays now, because a checklist got fixed, and that is all she ever asked for. It is all she has ever asked for, at every table she has ever been made to prove herself at, for 58 years. Not an apology, not a settlement, not a viral video with 2 million views and nothing at the end of it. Just the missing line, put back where it belonged, so that the next person who reads it, and there is always a next person, arrives at a step that makes sense. Elijah Pryor spent 31 years handing airplanes to other men and standing back to watch them go up. His daughter sat down in 2A, and she stayed there.